Hello, everyone. I think we have started already. I'm just going to check that the audio is working correctly on YouTube, and then we start with the session. Right? Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to see you here again. Today, we're not going to have the opportunity to interact with the session, right? Because yesterday internet was not working correctly. We had a lot of trouble with it, and then sometimes the screen goes crazy, and then I don't move, but then I talk, and then there's like a big problem with this, right? So today I'm just going to present the information for you guys, and if you have any questions, please make feel free to write them down on the chat, and then I will be reading the messages to answer all those questions. Okay. Well, yesterday, again, my dogs. I'm sorry. Yesterday we worked. Yesterday, we were working with two different methods. Those were the CLL, Community Language Learning, and we also work with the TPR method. And well, some of the most important characteristics we can mention, just like to have a review of yesterday's session, is that the CLL or community language learning was based more on having students working together to build concepts about language in terms of meanings, in terms of rules, in terms of everything, right? Students were supposed to work together in order for them to create their language and more specifically for them to negotiate meaning in a way within their classes, within their classroom, right? So the CLL was also considered as one of the most important methods because it proposed the concept of the whole person. Remember, in here, we didn't just care about teaching them like grammar rules, verbs, and those structures, but we were also worried about the rest of the person, like their physical situation. Give me a second. I'm sorry about the dog. I'm sorry, I needed to tell them to stop because I get distracted very easily. And then, you have to be moving a lot of things here in the computer, and then the dog's barking, and then it's very hot today. It's a difficult day, right? Okay, well, I was telling you about the CLL and the whole person concept that it was really important. It was like such a turning point in English teaching methodologies because now it presented new aspects of the human being that teachers needed to work with. Before, teachers just care about like having their students communicating in the situations, in specific situations. But this time, when we started to see that there were other things, but not just the language part, teachers started to create new alternatives, to create new materials, new ways of approaching their students. So it was an important method, I think, because of this specific concept, right? And again, like teachers or linguists started to see communication in a community. That was also an important thing within this method because language cannot be like we cannot put it apart from community, right? Language is meant to be used with a group of people, among a group of people. So then the concept of community was also important for language teaching. After that, I think we started to talk about the TPR, which is another method in which we saw the important thing of linking language production and language learning with physical movements, right? With physical activity. It was important because, according to some linguists and teachers, this created a real connection between the concept and the meaning it had. Yesterday, I mentioned something to you about the pragmatics and semantics and all that stuff that we have also checked in this course, and the importance for students of having a representation of something. Sometimes words simply don't have, or they lack a meaning, because those could be like objects or concepts that they haven't ever been exposed to. So using TPR was an important source for teachers to have a meaningful connection between the word and something that meant something for the students, right? Like, they tried to give meaning to concepts and words through movements, through gestures, through like realia. We mentioned that also yesterday. TPR was also important because it started to take into account students' need to move, students need to like to do something with their body, but not just like being there physically, and then the brain was just busy, but the body was tired of being in a class. Remember, this was also like an important part for those students who had different intelligences. That was also important, and that's something we're also going to learn here later on. But it was important because teachers could sorry, I got distracted, because yeah, because teachers started to take into account those students who learned differently, but which were who were not like the rest. You remember, as time went by, teachers started to observe that some students learned better when they were listening, some others learned better when they were doing, some others learned that some other students learned better when they were like writing. There were different skills that students had. So the TPR was like a good opportunity for those kinesthetic students to learn because they were able to move, right? So it came to solve some aspects of learning specifically. All right. So are there any questions? So far, so good. Uh, uh, um, Let me see if you wrote something on the chat. And to answer. No, you didn't answer anything. Hi, Coco. It's nice to read your message. Hello, Sandra. It's nice to see you around. Well, yeah. Today we're going to work with another method. This will be the last one, I promise. But well, not like the last one, but because then I realized that we also have to learn something about like what we're teachers doing now in the present, and we will work with this CLIL. I think it's CLI and CILI, something like that. I'm like doing this research. I need to be able to explain to you the concepts and the things more directly, and you will see, you will find out how nice it is to integrate all those concepts and principles about language teaching from the past into a new and more sophisticated way of teaching, a method, right? So we will learn them by next week, I think. It would be Thursday, and then on Friday we're having a review, and then on Saturday we're having an exam, right? About the evaluation in the TPR, Aurea, if you remember yesterday, we mentioned that evaluation was held through these kind of activities similar to the ones that were used in the classroom. Teachers would, for example, ask their students to role play, to like follow some instructions by listening. There are some evaluations for Cambridge, I think, and they are used mainly with kids, in which they tell them like draw a cat under the table, or touch your nose, for example. Those were commands given to students, and then you needed to see if students were able to do it, and that way you were receiving this feedback of whether your students learned what certain chunk meant for, like if they understood it, right? So if they understood the message, so they were going to be able to produce the action. Those were the kinds of exams used, Aurea, within the TPR method. Also, as we mentioned yesterday, the important thing here was oral production. So evaluation was like more directed to these, to oral production, through certain activities in which students had to produce, right? And yeah, don't worry, my pleasure. Okay, so for today, we're going to be working with this new method. It's very simple, but it's really interesting also, which is called communicative language teaching. I got a little confused because I hadn't read the titles consciously, and I got confused with these and with the other that was communicative language learning. But this time it's called differently, right? It's not community, it's communicative, which is similar in some aspects, but they have important differences, right? And also the other was like more like it was based on learning. It means the students, but this time we're going to talk about communicative language teaching, right? Some of the most important aspects of this method are or yes, they are based on the teacher's actions, on the teacher's performances. Okay, for us to be able to continue with this, we are going to watch a small part of a video, and I sent the link already if you want to watch it complete, so then you can do it. But today we're just going to watch like a couple of minutes um, for us to be able to continue with the class. All right. So here we go, and I will ask you to write your notes, please.
Today, we're going to start a brand new unit. And this unit will be focusing on a new function, persuasion. How do you convince people to believe in your point of view? Okay, I think this will be a useful skill for you to have both in your academic work and as you function in the larger world in everyday life. And the topic that we'll be using to work on this art or skill of persuasion will be the best place to live. We're going to talk about different kinds of living situations. Okay. Now, it so happens that my family is facing an important decision on this topic, the best place to live. And I'll tell you the reason why. Like many American families, maybe some that you know, my family, we all started out together. I grew up in New York City, and of course, everyone was together. And then, as the children grew up, we spread out all over the country. And now we live hundreds or thousands of miles from each other. Why do you think? Can you guess maybe why the children moved to different places?
Because
For work?
studies.
They got married and they moved away. Yeah. Vacation? Yeah. Well, my parents went on vacation to Florida once and they liked it and they decided to move there. Okay, so now the situation is this. My parents, Bill and Sarah, live in South Florida. I live in Western Massachusetts in the country with beautiful hills and streams and fields all around. My brother Charlie moved to a big city, Philadelphia. How many people have been to Philadelphia? Just a few. Okay, it's not too far from Washington. And my sister went to Wisconsin, to Madison, which is a small city. for her studies, and she liked it, and she stayed there. Now, here is the problem. My parents are tired of living so far from the children. They would like to get back together, at least for a while, with one of the children. The question is, which place to go to? Since they love each of the children equally, their decision is going to be based on which is the best place to live, a big city, the country, or a small city or town, right? And we are having a family meeting, family council, we call it, to make that decision. And you're going to decide which is the best place, as if you were my family. And I'll be very interested to see what your decision is, okay? Now, we're going to do a little bit of work before the role play on the structure of persuasion. And to start that off, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about where you live and what you like about where you live. How many people here live in a big city at home, in your own country? Most of you. How many live in what we would call a small city? Town. And how, just 2 or 3. And how many live in the country? Just 1 in the country? Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the big city then, since so many of you are from a big city. What are the reasons that you like living in a big city? What are some of the advantages that you find in big city life? Better jobs, okay?
After the students give all their reasons, the teacher gives an example of how one might make a case for living in a big city.
Finally, there's a wider variety of people that you can meet in a big city. Now, what I just did was structure my persuasion in a certain way that we like to do in English. And one term you can use for this structure is making a case. Okay, and if we look at this structure, it's what I just did. We open citing one reason, and we say something like to begin with or first of all, and then we strengthen or build the argument. We cite additional reasons, and we use some of these expressions to make a transition from one reason to another. Besides that, in addition, moreover, furthermore. And the third part of the argument, or making the case, is perhaps a summary of the main reason or a final reason, right? Now, who can, working with this structure, who can make a case for, let's say, South Florida? Many of you know about Florida. How many people have been to Florida yet? A few of you, but you've all heard of it. Who can make a case for living in Florida using that kind of a formula? Who can start off? Martha?
Well, okay, I should try to convince. But in short, I think that's the place convenient for you, and it has a very good weather too, all year round.
Absolutely.
You should go there.
I'm ready to go. Goodbye. Yes, who's going to teach you? Okay, well, that's very good. That's the idea. And that's the type of argument you can make in a written form, or when you're, for example, at a business meeting and you're trying to present your point of view, you might use this kind of structure. Okay? Now, we're going to go to the role play that I mentioned before, and you're each going to get a chance to practice making a case. Okay? Now, here is what we're going to do in the role play. First of all, you're going to divide into groups of 4, and you will each receive a card. On the card is your identity for the role play. Each of you, your home. Additional reasons, what you will do, sing argument. Come back in the large.
With one of your children, you have to live with the oldest. One, yes.
Oldest.
Yes, yes.
Yes, same thing in our case.
Same situation. And the two of the children can help the oldest for entertaining her parents. That's no problem.
Next to
See if it's on.
to my country, and it can come. It can.
Remember,
it can
ask me if
come
you have any questions about any of the
to
places.
see us. And I think you have to come in our country, my country.
It's not very polite. It's not very polite. No, the ear is
The
very
air is
good.
clean.
But
Yes.
I don't know.
You're not sure if they're telling you the truth.
Okay, in this case,
Philadelphia.
Yeah, the big city might be more polluted. And
Yes.
that, yeah, maybe that's a reason for the country. Yeah.
Parents' situation.
Okay.
Parents are still working.
No, the parents are retired.
Yeah, but I can offer work in Massachusetts. It's a very nice work.
okay, let us
I have
listen.
reasons.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, you have your reasons.
Small city.
Yeah.
Teacher, attention. The parents in the group need to decide now. So please decide and tell everyone your reasons right now. Okay?
It's time to decide.
The big
Who was a parent here? Victor? What?
Okay, so we're back now to the presentation I prepared for you. Just let me find it. Well, as you could see here, the techniques that the teacher used this time were similar to others, were similar to the techniques that are used in other methods, right? The role play or role playing is one of the most important techniques because most teachers use it, and it can be adapted to many different methods with different approaches and with different objectives also, you know, because like for example, using a role play activity can help you see if your students understand language structures, language forms, language use, and they can help you for many, many different situations. All right. Well, this was the first slide that I was supposed to show to you, but I didn't. But yeah, welcome everyone. Well, the communicative language teaching. I would like to read your messages first to see what are your comments about this method. What can you identify? What aspects do you consider important to mention that makes or that make this approach as one of the most well, not as one of the most important, but I would like you to tell me something about the method, right? What are the most important characteristics that you observed in this video, right? So I read your messages now. Aurea, thank you, thank you. The messages are like coming all together. Let me show them first. They don't show up here, but yeah, the comments say the students need to understand the language socially. That's really important, right? That's one of the most important principles of this method, because language is or cannot be isolated from social context, right? Language had a meaning, language had a purpose according to the place where they were going to use the language. So that's also really important to highlight, right? So it says the teacher uses real life situations to introduce the topic. Definitely true. That's also important to mention, right? Um, yes, the teacher had to base the language content on something real in the world, right? Again, we sometimes say that we try to take the real world into the classroom by bringing some newspapers, but then we have these kind of activities in which our students don't use the newspaper as we do it in real world, right? So we use newspaper to find a phone number and call for asking for information about a job or about a product. So that's what students have to do, and that's what the teacher did here in this video, right? In this short video, the teacher was or gave the students different roles for them to be able to solve a problem in a way. They were trying to convince someone else to go live in a specific place because they thought it was the best place to live. So the problem here was to convince someone, or that was the situation at least. It says it's for advanced level, not necessarily. Nevertheless, in this video we watched, students were like higher intermediate or high intermediate. I don't think they were basic, but they were not advanced either. So I think this method can be used for any kind of students, like basic, intermediate, or advanced students. The teacher gives clue cards to help with the role playing. Yes, that's true, Terry. And I could conclude here that this method is really structured and it's teacher controlled, right? Because the teacher decided who the students were going to be and the role play. And that's good, because depending on the person, depending on your role, that's the language you will use. If you are the one trying to convince, you probably are using certain forms of language and certain uses of language than when you are like being convinced, right? You will use other expressions, other forms, right? There's nothing, Sandra, just hello. Before that, it's advanced level, there's nothing but hello. Using the social practice of the language. Yes, Rosalba, that's really important. Social practice of languages, like language use, in other words, right? Students work in small groups, they correct each other. That's also true. Students needed to work like together, and they were helping each other in terms of correcting mistakes because students play an important role within this method. Students were active participants of all the process. They were not just learning and memorizing and repeating, they were like actively helping each other, and that's also important. Teacher was monitoring the teamwork. That's true, and that's one of the roles of the teacher. The teacher was observing, helping. There is another word we will see in the next slices. Teacher identifies the characteristics of students for. Yes, that's also true. That's very important. At the beginning, the teacher was like doing this brainstorming to know about students' opinions, backgrounds, and yeah, that's true. So the teacher was really like collecting this information necessary for him to be able to establish or to set an appropriate environment for everyone to learn, right? Errors are part of the learning process. Completely true. Errors were not seen as something dramatically incorrect, like, oh no, you made a mistake. You have to rephrase. You have to remember next time that you don't put together the verb to be and another verb unless it is with ing. No, teachers didn't do that when they used this method. Errors were seen as a natural step on the learning process, and they were considered as something positive because the students could or well, they were errors were evidence of the learning process. It was an evidence that students were learning, so they were seen as something natural and good at the same time. The class is very structured and organized. True, completely true. And that's something we really have to take into account anytime we think of using this method, right? Because if something just doesn't come up well as you were planning, you should have a plan B with materials, with students' reactions, because sometimes we plan nice classes and everything's working well. Like the computer works, the internet works, everything works, but your students are not in the mood. So there's nothing, well, yeah, there's something you can do about it, but sometimes it's quite complicated because it doesn't depend on you completely, right? As other things do. For example, in your planning, the materials depend on you, right? But students' attitude most of the times doesn't. Teacher presents the structure before students speak. That's true, and that's important also. There was oral production. As you could see, the emphasis here was students speaking. Nevertheless, there were other skills that were also observed and practiced, specifically some skills like grammar. Grammar was important, and students needed grammar structures to learn, right? Can students use L1 or is not allowed? I think L1 was not prohibited, but it wasn't like very used in the classroom. But anyways, let me check that specific part. Uh, 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 um, just give me a second, please. Well, language was seen as the means, or as the means for communication. Language was seen not just as something students used to learn about language, but it was seen as something they need for communication. L1 was not like prohibited, but it was not allowed because what the teacher wanted was the students to be able to use the target language in the appropriate context with the appropriate people. Mm, like, yeah. So I think L1 was not allowed, or it was not used at least by the teachers, right? And culture was also important, but specifically this everyday lifestyle culture, like everything what happened in for like in an English speaking country, like every day was what students needed as cultural information, right? It was necessary. So yes, L1 was not used and was not like really important. All right. At the beginning, the teacher has the opportunity to identify needs of the students. Yes, that's true, and it's important. The goal is to communicate. Imelda, that's true. The goal is for students to be able to talk, but not just like in terms of accuracy of language structures, but also in terms of quality of language use. We will see now why I mean by this, right? All right. So yes, you're very smart. You're very, very smart. You know everything. I don't know what I am doing here. Well, here it is. My allergies are killing me. I'm sorry. Communicative language teaching had those like three main points about the foundations, like theoretical foundations. Communication required, or the teachers thought that communication required even more than just mastering linguistic structures, like linguistic rules. It was not just enough for students to know the simple present, the future, the verb to be, etc. It was just a part of it, but it was not like everything they needed. Students needed more. Students needed like a whole person information, or a whole person course for them to be able to learn English or any other language. So the communicative competence was considered as an important part of learning and teaching within this method. In other words, the communicative competence means sorry, I'm going to the restroom. Just give me a second, please. Yeah, and then I was telling you about the communicative competence. In other words, it is when to speak, how to do it, and to whom the message would be delivered, right? And that's what the teachers wanted to tell their students or help their students identify these three aspects, right? When to speak or when to use a word or a structure, how to use it, and like who you can use those expressions and words to or with, right? It was like you cannot use hi everywhere you go. And if you are like applying for a job, you're not going to say hey dude or something like that because it wouldn't be appropriate. So that's what we mean by communicative competence, right? Also, it is important to understand from this perspective that interdependence of language and communication was something really important. We cannot set language apart from communication. Language is communication. It's not just a set of rules. It's not just a set of or like a big bunch of words. It's communication, and specifically oral communication in this approach. The goals here were to communicate. No, it was to develop. I'm sorry, the communicative language competence. That was the goal. They wanted their students to know the language. It was like something we can take as granted, like it was included, right? Grammar, reading, everything was included, but they like were pointing at communicative language competence for them to be able to use the language in appropriate form, in the appropriate environment, etc., etc., etc. The communicative language teaching or CLT, we can identify within this method the following roles for the teacher. It was like completely directed by the teacher, as I think Terry said, with the class, like it was very structured because the teacher was there like knowing what was next, like what's next, what who has to say this, who's going to do this. So it was directed by the teacher. The teacher was also an advisor, as you could see. I think it was Sandra who said that the teacher was monitoring the class work, specifically when they were working in groups. So the teacher was there giving students advice about how to use the language. He was not correcting, as you could see. He was like just giving some ideas of how to use the language, because again, I love CLT so much because they understood language was creativity and that there were several forms for the same function. If I want to say something, I can find at least three different possible ways of expressing that. And the teacher was not telling their students like, no, 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 no. If you are introducing yourself, you have to say hello. My name is no. The teacher just proposed some possible forms for the student to express something. All right, and the students were active, and they were they were active, and they also were participating or participative in the construction of language, right? They were negotiating the meaning of language. I'm going to put that away. They were in this negotiation of meaning in language. What do we mean by this? It is that a sentence, as we saw in our previous units, can have different meanings depending on how you said it, like the tone of voice and who you said it to, and who you were when you said the word, etc., etc., etc. It all will depend on many different things. So the students work together to define the meaning of those particular pieces of language, right? Some of the typical activities were games, active techniques such as problem solving, debates, right? But specifically games, I would say that it's important to rescue here. And learning language rules were also important activities within this method, right? I have more here, but for example, let me find them. Some other activities, for example, could be like using authentic materials. Again, authentic materials are those that were not designed specifically for teaching but can be adapted to it. Examples: newspapers, restaurant menus, an illustrated instruction guide, etc., etc. Things that were not made for teaching but can be used. Scrambled sentences in which students were supposed to unscramble them. Language games, all kind of language games. Picture strip stories, right? Role plays were also important here. So those are some of the most famous activities. The strengths, well, TLT was linked, or it was based on real life situations, and it's a very, very good advantage. It's a strength because you were actually helping students know like the place or the different scenarios where they could use the language. So it was helpful for them to know this and know some of those experience probably. You learned English, but you didn't know like what you were going to use it for, right? You just remember the simple past, but then when someone asks you, "What did you do yesterday?" you sometimes don't know how to answer because you didn't practice these social interaction situations. Um, there was an important cultural background to language, and as it is important, it can be considered as a strength because students really knew how to use the language and what the language was for, the purpose and the function of it. And there were high levels of motivation for students because the students really found useful what they were learning with their real lives. Again, real lives. Again, these classes and these methods were used in foreign countries. Like all these was born, I think, in the United States and Canada probably. And the experiment you just observed, you just watched on the video, was actually held in Canada. And the students were living in a country where they were going to use the language they're learning. So there were like high levels of motivation because it was really meaningful to them. It was useful. What they saw in class was going to be used probably that same evening on the street with their family, with their friends. So it was really, really good for them. And oh no. Some of the weaknesses, for example, language function versus language forms, that could be considered as something positive also. Uh, Language functions were were highly like estimated. Yeah, they were highly estimated. It was more important for the teacher to help students with language functions than helping them with language accuracy or language forms, language correctness. We cannot say that one of them was more important than the other. I correct myself, but the teacher was more like interested on students knowing how to use the language and when to use the language, right? And in a proper way. So language forms was important, but not so. It was not the emphasis. It was not the focus of this method. And then there was this diversity. It's wrong here, of forms for a specific function. It can be considered as positive and negative because you could have several structures that could help you express the exact same thing. So it was good for students because they wouldn't feel frustrated when the teacher told them like, no, you didn't say this correct. You were supposed to say this. No. So creativity in language was something positive, right? Nevertheless, it was something hard for the teacher and for other students. Why? Let's say that you are like a more advanced student in the classroom, and then you use a structure that probably you deduced from somewhere, like having a conversation with a friend, and then you could use it, right? You can use it in the class. Then this student uses the structure, is correct, the teacher doesn't say anything, but then the other students who don't know the structure will, or they might feel confused, right? I don't know if I'm making my point clear, but it could happen. And I think that's all about this method. So I would like to see your comments, your concerns, your anything you have to say. Sandra asked, how do you guys think evaluation should be? Well, evaluation with this method was about production. It was about oral production or written production. There were not like formal exams like paper and pen or paper and pencil exams. There were more like interviews, like the teacher would use like a guide to ask students something about the class, but not like structures, not like grammar. Like, let's say, if they learned how to ask for directions or how to give a direction, then the teacher might ask or propose a case to the student, as the teacher mentioned in the video, for the student to use the language and solve the situation, right? So that was how evaluation was held. All right, so I see your questions, more questions. It's also important to mention in terms of feelings and students' mood. This method was like very friendly to students' feelings, because the teacher would be like very, like the teacher with within this method is not correcting the students all the times. The teacher is just giving advice of how to use the language, but it all depends on the students, like what kind of language they want to use or what kind of language they need in terms of formality, in terms of variety. Let's say I don't like this word, so I cannot use it, I prefer these examples, such as die and passed away. You know, I remember one of my teachers told me once that it's better to say passed away because it's like more it's kinder, it's softer, right? Yeah, and it happens also in Spanish. We don't say like se murió, or we say falleció. Some other people use other expressions that are even softer. So yeah, the teacher was there helping students to do this. And yeah, Coco, that's what I am saying actually. So the teacher was giving students not correction, but advice, right? The teacher was giving them advice. And that was one of the factors or the aspects why students wouldn't face or cope with anxiety or stress, right? Because they were not being corrected. They were just receiving advice. Anything else? I'm sorry, I'm doing this, but yeah, my allergies. So, guys, you can also check the presentation. I've sent you the link several times, but in case you need it again, just let me know. Aurea, just remember you told me to change the slices that were not correct, which I didn't. I completely forgot about that, but I'm doing it right now, right after the class ends, and I'm going to tell you when it's ready so you can check it, right? So you can download it. Just please make sure you don't modify the presentation online. Otherwise, those changes would be saved, and then other students are not going to be able to see the presentation as it was. If you want to modify it, if you want to do anything with the presentation, you can just download it and then change anything you consider appropriate, right? Terry says, I think this method is more practical for students to speak as it is meaningful. Completely agree. I completely agree with you. And indeed, this time students have the appropriate amount of input and practice, as you saw. Remember, the TPR also aimed to have students producing orally the language, but there was not so much practice, right? It was more like understanding commands, but not understanding the language use. But this time, I think this problem was solved because students were supposed to use the language among them, and the teacher sometimes was part of that communicative situation because the teacher was not correcting. The teacher was talking to the students, providing different words, different examples. So yes, I think they did it with this approach. You're welcome. I agree with Terry. They talk about real life situations. Yes, exactly. Those are like topics all of us use when we meet someone with our friends, right? So they're like life like situations. Students will be able to use language in the right situation. At the end of the unit, or at the end of the like the program, yeah, completely. Students are going to be able to use the language in an appropriate way, with all the rules, the social conventions, the social agreements. Sometimes those are unspoken agreements that we don't know, right? I mean, you are not going to see on the dictionary, no uses la palabra güey con tu jefe. It doesn't say there. That's something socially understood, and no one tells you that. I mean, that's something you just know because of the contact with the culture. I know I cannot call you way, none of you, because I've been living in this country time enough to know this word is not appropriate for addressing my students or my co-workers, right? So that's something the teacher had to give the students. The teacher provided this information for students to be able to use the language correctly, right? And it was like helping students not to face those uncomfortable situations we've talked about before, right? So I think that would be it for today. And next class, we will check the content-based methods and the newest methods we're using. But I think by now you have received enough information to start understanding the process or the history of language teaching with those methods, right? So I just want you guys to start thinking of the differences, similarities between those methods. Research a little bit more. I gave you a book. I sent you the link of a book, which is like amazing. Please don't just feel like, yeah, what I have told you, it's true because it comes from a book and from different sources. But what I mean is that you guys go for more. I mean, research a little bit more, read more the book passages, and find out more information about the different methods. I really recommend you to do it because now we have a general perspective of those things. But the more you read, the better it would be, and the better you would do in your exam, right? Okay, so if there's no more questions, I just have to tell you thank you for being here with me today. I hope this helped you. And remember, like, if there are questions about other topics, about previous topics, just let me know. And yeah, I will be happy to help you solve your doubts, right? Well, thank you. Thank you, all of you. Take care of yourselves, and I hope I can talk to you again next week, Thursday at 7 o'clock or 7 and like 10 past 7, probably. It depends on how fast I work on that day. Okay. So, girls, because all of you are girls, I think. Yeah, David is not around anymore, but it's nice to it's nice to know you're doing well. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you and goodbye. Bye bye. Bye, Rosalba. Bye, Sandra, Aurea, Coco, Raquel, Sandra, Terry. All of you, goodbye. Imelda, goodbye.